On November 26, 1922, a man holding a candle leaned toward a tiny hole punched through an ancient sealed door. Behind him stood his wealthy patron, impatiently asking if he could see anything. The man stayed silent for several long seconds, then managed to force out just 3 words. Yes, wonderful things. Behind that door, in complete darkness, a nearly forgotten boy pharaoh's tomb had waited untouched for 3,000 years, filled to the brim with gold. This discovery would turn an obscure young king into the most recognizable name in ancient Egypt and give birth to a legend about a deadly curse that still lives on today. Today we'll go through the real story behind this find, how it was discovered, why it survived when every other tomb had been looted in antiquity, and what modern science has actually learned about a boy who died more than 3,000 years ago. To understand the scale of this discovery, you need to picture what Egyptian archaeology looked like at the start of the 20th century. The Valley of the Kings, a narrow, rocky gorge on the west bank of the Nile, had served for centuries as the burial ground of the pharaohs of the New Kingdom, who hoped that deep tombs carved into the rock would shield them and their treasures from thieves. It didn't work. By the early 1900s, the valley had been dug over again and again, and every tomb that was found turned out to be empty, cleaned out completely back in antiquity, often within just a few years of the burial, sometimes with the direct involvement of the very priests and guards who were supposed to protect them. Nothing but bare walls and broken stone. A firm belief took hold that there was nothing left to find in the valley. One prominent expert flatly declared it exhausted, and plenty of well-known archaeologists simply gave up on it. But there was one man who refused to give up, the English archaeologist Howard Carter. Stubborn, meticulous, not the easiest person to get along with, he'd started his career as a simple artist, copying ancient wall paintings for more established scholars. And it was precisely that artist's eye for detail that eventually led him to the greatest discovery in the history of archaeology. Carter was convinced that somewhere in the valley lay the tomb of an obscure king named Tutankhamun, a name that had nearly been erased from history by that point. A handful of earlier finds, seals, scattered pieces of pottery, hinted that this pharaoh had been buried somewhere nearby, yet his tomb had never been located. For years, he dug on money from his patron, Lord Carnarvon, an aristocrat who'd fallen in love with Egypt after coming there to recover his health in its warm climate. Year after year, nothing. The patron's patience, generous as he was, wasn't limitless, and after many empty seasons he announced that this next one would be the last. Carter was so certain he was right that, according to legend, he even offered to fund that final season out of his own pocket, just for one more chance. And that's when fate took its remarkable turn. At the very start of that last season, only days after work resumed, Carter's workers were clearing an area near the entrance to an already known tomb, where ancient workers' huts had once stood. Under one of those huts, a step cut into the rock appeared, then another, then a whole staircase, leading down into the earth. According to legend, it was a water boy among the workmen who first noticed the step while idly clearing sand, though whether that's actually true is impossible to say. Barely containing his excitement, Carter ordered the digging to continue, and the staircase led to a sealed door bearing untouched ancient seals. That could only mean one thing. The tomb behind that door might be undisturbed. Carter then did perhaps the hardest thing he ever did in his life. He had the staircase filled back in and sent a telegram to Lord Carnarvon in England, so his patron could arrive in time to witness the opening. For several weeks, Carter waited, guarding his secret entirely alone. When Carnarvon finally arrived, the staircase was cleared again. They passed through the first door, down a corridor choked with rubble, and reached a second sealed door. Carter made a small hole in the corner, held up a candle, and the flame flickered as hot air rushed out from inside. Out of the darkness, slowly, gold and the strange shapes of fantastical animals and statues began to emerge. When the hole was widened and the archaeologists finally stepped inside, The very first room, an antechamber, left them stunned. It was crammed with treasures: gilded couches shaped like fantastical animals, dismantled chariots, chests, statues gleaming in the lamplight. Everything lay in what looked like disarray, and at first it wasn't clear whether the tomb was intact or had already been plundered. But the sheer amount of gold left no doubt, and this was only the front room. More chambers waited beyond. What lay ahead had no equal in the entire history of archaeology. The tomb turned out to be crammed with treasure and, most astonishingly, almost completely untouched. Thousands of objects sat exactly where priests had left them more than 3,000 years earlier. Gilded thrones, weapons, jewelry, chests full of clothing, vessels, furniture, even food and wine. Everything the Egyptians believed a king might need in the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that after death, a person continued to live in another world, so they equipped the deceased with everything that might be useful, from a golden throne down to plain sandals and boxes of grain. Inside, they even found 2 tiny coffins holding the mummified bodies of infants, apparently Tutankhamun's own children, who had died young and were taken with him into eternity. A poignant detail, a reminder that behind all that gold was an entirely ordinary human tragedy. The rooms were packed so densely that it took Carter and his team roughly 10 years to carefully catalog, photograph, and remove every single item. Over 5,000 objects in total. Carter worked with almost obsessive precision, recording the position of every single piece. And that meticulousness turned the excavation into a model of scientific method. Since before him, treasure hunters had usually just hauled things out without any regard for how they'd been laid out originally. It took years of painstaking labor. Every fragile object had to be stabilized before it could even be touched, since the wood and fabric had decayed over millennia and would have crumbled at the slightest careless movement. Carter devoted almost 10 years of his life to this work, essentially the rest of his career. But the main event was still waiting in the burial chamber. There, gilded wooden shrines were nested one inside another like Russian dolls, and inside them stood a stone sarcophagus, and inside that, 3 more coffins nested within each other. The innermost one was cast entirely from solid gold and weighed over 100 kilograms. Inside that final coffin lay the mummy of the young pharaoh, its face hidden beneath the now famous golden burial mask with its blue stripes. Today, arguably the single most iconic symbol of ancient Egypt anywhere in the world. Weighing more than 10 kilograms, the mask is cast from pure gold and inlaid with lapis lazuli, turquoise, and colored glass. The craftsmanship behind those calm, youthful features still astonishes modern jewelers. The burial chamber itself, the only decorated room in the entire tomb, was painted with scenes of the funeral and the king's journey into the afterlife. The mummy itself, though, wasn't handled so gently. During embalming, the body had been thoroughly doused in resins that hardened over time and fused the remains and the mask permanently to the coffin, forcing Carter to literally cut the mummy apart to extract it, something scientists have regretted ever since. So who was this boy, for whom all this splendor was created? Here lies another paradox of this story. In life, Tutankhamun was a fairly minor ruler. He took the throne as a child of about 9 and died young, around 18 or 19, after reigning for roughly 10 years. He fought no great wars, built no colossal temples. What's more, his reign fell during an extremely difficult period. His father was, in all likelihood, the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, who did something unheard of. He rejected all of Egypt's old gods and tried to introduce worship of a single solar deity, turning the entire country upside down, shutting old temples, stripping the powerful priesthood of its authority, and building an entirely new city in the middle of nowhere dedicated to his one god. For Egyptians who had lived with their familiar gods for millennia, this was a genuine shock, and the country descended into turmoil. When young Tutankhamun took the throne, he had to reverse all of it, restoring the old gods and the old order. and even his own name was changed to erase the memory of his father's heresy. At birth, he'd been named after the disgraced sun disk god, but his name was later altered to honor the restored ancient deity instead. In practice, the boy king was governed by adult advisors and generals, who handled the actual business of returning the country to normal. After his death, his successors tried to erase this awkward era from history altogether. Along with his name, his statues were claimed by other kings, and his name was scratched out of the official king lists. That very obscurity, oddly enough, is what saved his treasure. There's a striking historical justice to it. The great pharaohs who built colossal monuments and loudly glorified themselves drew the attention of tomb robbers straight to their burial sites and lost everything, while a modest boy erased from memory kept his riches intact precisely because of his own insignificance. Now, the central mystery. Why did Tutankhamun's tomb survive when every other royal tomb had been thoroughly plundered in antiquity? The answer lies in a few lucky coincidences. First, the tomb was small and modest, clearly never intended for a king in the first place. Tutankhamun apparently died so suddenly that a proper royal tomb hadn't been finished in time, and he was hastily buried in a small existing tomb that looked more suited to a nobleman. Second, and this is the decisive factor, the entrance was hidden fairly quickly. About a century after the burial, workers building a tomb for another pharaoh nearby dumped rock debris, and later their own huts, right over the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb. Over time, it was simply forgotten, buried under rubble while life carried on above it, with no one suspecting a forgotten king lay below. It's worth noting that the tomb was in fact entered twice by thieves shortly after the burial. The evidence is there in disturbed items and hastily resealed doors. But both times, the robbers seem to have been interrupted, managing to grab only a handful of small valuables without reaching the main treasures. Soon after, the entrance was buried for good, sealing the tomb for over 3,000 years. And now we arrive at the most famous part of this story, the legend of the pharaoh's curse. Shortly after the tomb was opened, an event occurred that shook the world. Lord Carnarvon, the patron behind the excavation, died suddenly in Cairo just a few months later. The cause was a simple blood infection from an infected mosquito bite he'd accidentally nicked while shaving. But that was more than enough for the public. Newspapers instantly blew it into a sensation. The pharaoh was taking revenge for the disturbance of his rest. Stories circulated about a supposed tablet found in the tomb warning that death would come to anyone who disturbed the king's peace, though no such tablet ever actually existed. From there, it only escalated. People claimed that at the exact moment of the Lord's death, all the lights in Cairo went out, and his favorite dog back in England howled and dropped dead at the very same instant. Every subsequent death of anyone even loosely connected to the excavation was immediately chalked up to the mummy's revenge, and celebrities like the creator of Sherlock Holmes, who had a genuine interest in the occult, publicly backed the idea that supernatural forces had guarded the tomb. That's how a legend was born that turned out to be almost as enduring as the treasure itself. Newspapers of the era quickly realized that a cursed pharaoh sold far better than any scientific report. But what does cold statistics actually say about all this? The curse simply doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Researchers tallied the fates of everyone present at the tomb's opening, and it turned out that the overwhelming majority lived long, perfectly ordinary lives and died at a ripe old age, decades later. Howard Carter himself, the man who personally opened the tomb and disturbed the mummy with his own hands, lived another 17 years after that and died of natural causes in his 60s. If the curse were real, it should have struck him first of all. As for the few who really did die shortly after the excavation, that's just ordinary mortality statistics among the dozens of people connected to the find. The public simply remembered the coincidences and ignored everyone who lived on for decades. There was also a more cautious theory that mold or bacteria might have developed inside a tomb sealed shut for thousands of years, potentially harmful to people with weaker health. and researchers really have found such spores when sampling air inside ancient tombs. But turning a rare mold into the vengeful curse of an entire pharaoh takes quite a leap of imagination. Put simply, the pharaoh's curse is a brilliant piece of newspaper invention, a stroke of marketing genius, not reality. Real science, without any mysticism, has told us far more about Tutankhamun than the original discoverers could ever have dreamed of. Using X-rays, CT scans, and ancient DNA analysis, researchers have essentially interrogated the mummy of the boy king. It turned out that Tutankhamun was a fairly sickly young man. He had a clubfoot, which likely meant he walked with a limp and needed a cane. And indeed, dozens of walking sticks were found in his tomb, which indirectly supports this. From his remains, scientists reconstructed his approximate appearance, and instead of the mighty warrior suggested by the golden mask, what emerged was a frail, short young man with a childishly slender build and a bad leg. An ordinary, sickly teenager who suddenly had the crown of a great empire thrust upon him. Traces of malaria were found in his body, suggesting he'd been repeatedly infected. DNA analysis also revealed that his parents were most likely full brother and sister, a common practice in Egyptian royal families meant to preserve the purity of the royal bloodline, though it led to hereditary health problems in their offspring. Tutankhamun himself was married to his own half-sister, and those two stillborn infants found in his tomb were apparently their shared children, who never gave the king an heir. For a long time, there was debate over the cause of his early death. A murder theory gained traction after an X-ray revealed a suspicious injury at the back of his skull, spawning an entire detective story about a palace conspiracy. More careful examination disproved that theory. The skull damage most likely occurred after death, either during embalming or from Carter's own careless handling while extracting the mummy. Today, most scientists lean toward the idea that this frail, sickly boy died from complications of a severe leg fracture, possibly from a fall, which led to a fatal infection, especially given a body already weakened by malaria, and so, from a golden symbol, Tutankhamun turned, for us, into a living, fragile, suffering human being. It's hard to overstate what this discovery meant for the world. Opening the tomb sparked a full-blown case of Tutmania, a worldwide obsession with ancient Egypt that shaped fashion, architecture, jewelry design, and art for decades afterward. Egyptian motifs turned up everywhere, in dress and hairstyle designs, in fabric patterns, in the look of buildings and movie theaters. The pharaoh's treasures toured the world in massive exhibitions, with enormous lines forming in every city, and the golden mask became, arguably, the single most recognizable symbol of antiquity on the planet. But something else matters even more. Before this find, no one had ever seen a complete royal Egyptian burial. Only thanks to Tutankhamun did we learn, in full detail, exactly how the Egyptians buried their rulers, what they believed, and what their daily life looked like. One modest tomb, belonging to an insignificant boy king, told us more about ancient Egypt than every plundered tomb of the great pharaohs combined. And there lies the ultimate irony of this story. The most forgettable of the pharaohs became the most famous precisely because he was forgotten, and a brilliant newspaper hoax about a curse only added to his immortality. Today, looking at his golden mask, calmly gazing back at us across the millennia, we don't think about curses or gold. We think of a fragile boy who ruled a great nation and died before he ever really got to grow up, whose once-forgotten name is now known the world over.